Good afternoon. My name is Kirk Sykes, and I'm a co-managing partner of Accordia Partners, as well as the former chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Today, I'm joined by Marques Benton, who is the Chief Diversity Officer and Vice President of the First District's Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. And we're very, very appreciative of this forum with the hopes of sharing some actionable activities that you all may undertake in your respective companies to transform them and help them be more inclusive and more relevant in this moment. But first, I'd like to thank all the people whose names you see on the screen there, ULI, NAIOP, GREB, CREW, BCC, and REEC for this coalition, unprecedented coalition of working together to bring this message to you today and reaching out to their networks. So I began working with Marques in 2008 when I became a member of the board of the Fed just 3 months before the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis. And I have been working with Marques to this day on the mission of diversity and inclusion. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston is a leader in the Federal Reserve System in this area of inclusion. And D&I outcomes that were mandated by Dodd-Frank have been implemented there for the last 12 years. So this moment that's 4 months old has been a 12-year experience, basically legislated into existence. So in 2012, inclusion was introduced by myself for the first time in the 100-year history of the Federal Reserve Bank. We were able to meet in Washington with Chairman Bernanke and Chairwoman Yellen, Vice Chairwoman Yellen, and very proud that the Boston Fed was the catalyst for that conversation amongst all the reserve banks in the country. Basically, the Boston Fed adopted a multi-pronged strategy for transforming itself. And that strategy has been in place now for better than a decade. And the hope is that our conversation today will help you identify components of that strategy that you may deploy in your own company. So let me get on to Marques now, who I'm very proud of and had a small role in his arrival at the role that he currently has. But Marques, as I said, is Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer and OMWI Director, Office of Minority Women Inclusion for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He's passionate about integrating evidence-based strategies that are measurable and improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Federal Reserve's workforce, workplace, and procurement policies. Marques is eager to learn from and share with other like-minded executives, and he's motivated to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in the financial services industry as a whole and society broadly. So before we move to Marques and our conversation about some things that we've worked on passionately together, I wanted to do a little level set in this moment. So why have this conversation with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston now? Monetary policy goals of the reserve banks in this country foster economic conditions that achieve both stable prices and maximal sustainable employment for the country. That's the Federal Reserve's dual mandate. COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter movement are at the intersection of the derailment of this mandate. Lack of inclusion is at the heart of this derailment, and most affected population is people of color. So it's very appropriate that we're having this conversation now with Marques because now matters. So why now? Millennials, ESG, and shareholder activism are a few reasons. New generations of investors are basically investing their conscience. There's been a rise in ESG, environmental, social, and governance investment in the last couple of months that is unprecedented in the history of this country. There have been huge outflows of capital from the S&P and huge inflows into ESG funds. And we are just in the infancy of this strategy. So Whether you really believe you're doing this for moral purpose or whether you're doing it financial gain, it really doesn't matter. But know that it is something that is verifiably beneficial to your and accretive to your companies. So why have this conversation with non-diverse leaders? Barack Obama said it best: no one is asking you to apologize for being white. No one is asking you to apologize for the sins of your ancestors. What we are asking is that you help dismantle the oppressive systems that they built and that you still benefit from. And that's a little harsh, but it's realistic. And I think to further make it real, the context for Black people in this country right now is important to consider. I like to say my 400 years of crimes is not your 4 months of awareness. So 1619, 1776, 1964, and 2020. Those are the dates I'd like you to remember. 1619, first slaves brought to America against their will. 1776, birth of America and the legal introduction of slavery. 1865, the 13th Amendment and emancipation didn't happen. And 1964, the Civil Rights Act, and 65, the Voting Rights Act, and 1968, the Fair Housing Act, all unfortunately not introduced in the way they should. And then lastly, 2020, the moment of Black Lives Matter. So by 2040, the United States will be a majority of diverse people. We are the majority. The numbers don't lie. The demographics say that we will be your client, we will be the populace, and we will have a voice. So once again, whether it's for financial gain or the reality that this is the growing demographic of our country, it's important to take note. Lastly, diverse teams get better outcomes. Whether proven by McKinsey that you get a 33% higher return from a diverse team, or any of the other studies that you can find at your leisure, who would be exclusive to the detriment and fiduciary peril of themselves and their company? I think none of us on this call. So hopefully what we're about to learn from Marques will lead us to avoid that peril. Marques?
So thanks, Kirk, and good afternoon. First, I do want to thank you, Kirk, for inviting me to speak to this group today. This is a wonderful opportunity. I also want to thank all the groups responsible for putting on today's webinar. I think, as Kirk mentioned, our goal today is really to have a good dialogue and back and forth about how to advance diversity and inclusion in your respective firms, but also how to advance diversity and inclusion in your industry. And I think I want to start by sharing our story and how we started this work at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So indulge me for just one moment. So this slide really describes our journey. We really started off in 2010, and actually there had been some work done prior to that by two other D&I leaders before Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act came into place, which mandated that all the regulatory agencies like the Reserve Banks stand up an Office of Minority Women Inclusion and appoint somebody like myself as the Omni Director and Chief Diversity Officer. But we had started before that because we, to all the points that Kirk mentioned, we saw this as a really important issue on a number of different fronts. But what we started to do, I'd say in earnest in 2010, is to begin by looking at our data. We had some assumptions about where we stood, how well we were doing, which were corrected by looking at the data. Having that data allowed us to have a really good dialogue about our assumptions, where we were making progress, where we weren't, and helped us to create a common focus around what we needed to do to address challenges, gaps, and issues. And it really also opened our eyes to the fact that this couldn't just be an HR-led, an Office of Diversity-led effort. We had to involve all the stakeholders, including our leaders, most importantly, but other stakeholders in our legal area, in our procurement area, and all the business leaders of the organization. And so we did that. And now we're at this sort of this last chevron of trying to take this work forward by really living our values. Sort of, you might think about that as walking our talk. What you will find as you engage in this journey is that this is a lot of work, and you have to really be dedicated and committed to not only providing resources, but staying at it, and staying at it even when you get challenged and don't see the immediate progress that you might be looking to attain. This next slide really gets at kind of how we frame this work strategically. So there's 4 key areas. The first is workforce and engaging management or engaging leaders, as I discussed earlier, and it's really going into the granularity of that data and trying to understand where the opportunities are, where the challenges are, and what we need to do to make progress. And developing action plans to do exactly that. So we have dashboards, we have action plans, we've tied incentives, D&I objectives to incentives to incent the right behavior. We've started, we are seeing some progress, but it's really taken a lot of work to get there. There's a workplace, so the top right quadrant there, which is really about your culture, and that really involves engaging staff. And so we've done that in numerous ways, but one of the key ways that we've done that is by developing and standing up these employee resource groups. These employee resource groups are primarily designed by protected classes, if you will, but they really engage across all of the organization and engaging staff in these issues of diversity and in particular inclusion. They help with our recruiting, our sourcing, our onboarding, and our retention of diverse staff. Because it's important that once you do all that work to get folks in the door, you want to keep and retain them. Bottom left quadrant, compliance. So we talked earlier about Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act. We are required every year to produce a report that publishes our data at our workforce level and in our procurement spend as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And so that's an important motivator. And we also really take this to heart from the standpoint of wanting to be a better organization by doing this work, not just doing it because there's a mandate to do it. And the last quadrant, bottom right, is about influence. And so here we have an External Diversity Advisory Council that really was the invention of Kirk, standing that up for us a number of years ago and leading from the chair of the board at the Fed, but then moving on to it in his current role as just not just, but a leader in the community, if you will. We have a New England Financial Services CEO Roundtable, where we bring in CEOs to talk about diversity and inclusion at the board of director level, at the senior executive level. And we found that it really has taken all 4 of these quadrants to be motivated, if you will, and activated and engaged in order to see the progress that we've seen over the last 10 or so years. We've had setbacks, and we've bounced back, and our kind of key areas of focus around making progress at the officer level for people of color have been achieved. Key areas of focus around improving diversity at a board of director level have been achieved. We've made tremendous success, had tremendous progress in our hiring, where we've had gaps for both women and Hispanics. There's still more to do, but it really has taken a concerted effort in engaging management, engaging staff, focusing on the data, and trying to live our values every day to make progress. So at a high level, why don't I just stop there and we can open this up for questions.
Great. Well, Marques, I think we're going to go through a few topics, you and I, in a dialogue, and then at the end of this, there'll be time for everyone to ask some questions for about 10 or 15 minutes. So I thought we would dive in on some of the things you just discussed, and I call them the big 5. And I hope we can have a conversation about what worked and what didn't work. And so starting with the first one, the External Diversity Advisory Council, basically getting what you need inside the Fed that didn't exist there before. And we went out, and it started with me kind of drafting my friends at Bank Boston and State Street, people of color who had done a great job in the private sector and sort of influencing the public sector. Talk a bit about how that has evolved, and talk maybe a bit about how that changed the bank from its original culture in 2008 when you started, just through the involvement of that group, and how other people could do this in their own firms.
Sure. So I'll say one of the ways it's evolved is that obviously we've added some new members from different industries, which has been really impactful. But the other thing is, I don't think we saw this coming, quite frankly. We've received referrals for senior level positions in our legal area and in other areas from this group. I think, as you know, our current general counsel, which is a senior vice president position, was formerly a member of our External Diversity Advisory Council. We never saw that coming. We never expected that. We expect we will be able to transition some of our EDAC members to board level, board of director roles at the bank, which you formerly sat on as our board, obviously, as our chair. But we think that this is a pool, if you will, and a pipeline at our board of director level, which I don't think we anticipated initially. And then
Hey, Marques, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It sounds like you may be blocking your microphone a little bit because your sound's going in and out a little. Is it?
Okay. I'll try to get closer. Is that
yes,
better?
That's working. Much better. Yeah.
Okay. So I will say, I'll try to rehash it real quickly. So hiring senior staff and getting referrals from the EDAC has been amazing. Seeing EDAC members transition to our executive committee, our most senior roles, has been incredible. Seeing that we will have board of director candidates that will come from our EDAC, kind of unbelievable. And the advice, counsel, and the vetting of our D&I strategies, tough strategies like tying D&I objectives to incentives. You and I went through that conversation. The EDAC took us through that conversation. I don't think we would have gotten there without the EDAC, quite frankly. I think it was instrumental. And so in so many ways, just the vetting, the referrals, the encouragement, and the pushing to some extent for us to be bold in our D&I journey has been instrumental. And I think other reserve banks can emulate that, and other firms, like the firms represented around this table, could emulate that and obtain the same kind of benefits.
And I think there were two other things that you might comment on about that EDAC, which is External Diversity Advisory Council again. One, the level of commitment from the president of the bank and the vice president of the bank, because it was a quarterly, not to be missed conversation where people sat down for a couple of hours and really dug in. It wasn't a topical kind of poke at it, first of all. And then, I think talk about that ability to be candid and close the door and talk about what works and doesn't, maybe.
Sure. So, yeah, I think top line, we've got our president and our first vice president that sit on the EDAC, and I don't believe they've missed a meeting. We have a few other senior executive level folks who sit at the table too. And yeah, I mean, I think you've said it to some extent. We've shared what we're doing, what we think works, what we think doesn't work. And it's been a very candid conversation with the EDAC about what's worked in their organizations, what hasn't worked, and what we should consider. So, I think that level of back and forth has just been invaluable. I know, we just moved the topic around equity. That was our last EDAC discussion. It's a very challenging conversation, but I think vetting it through the EDAC first before bringing it to our executive committee is a part of the reason we now have traction to build equity into our D&I strategy. That's pretty impactful.
I agree. So now let's move on to another one of the big five, the CEO roundtable. And so I remember right after Dodd-Frank was enacted, people were fighting to get in the room. And the CEO roundtable was a closed door environment where CEOs of major financial services companies could share their success or failure in terms of employing and having on their boards people of color and women. And I remember we started with women because we thought perhaps people would have achieved more in that arena, and then we thought we'd move on to people of color. And I think we had some successes. I think we also had some disappointments. And I also think over time, when it became clear that Dodd-Frank was not going to reach into people's firms as much as it did affecting the Fed and government agencies, we did have some loss of attention. So maybe talk to any of those that you can talk to, please.
Sure. So we did start off like gangbusters, and I think I take some of the hit for why we may have lost steam. So trying to get data from all the firms around, let's call it just diversity representation at the top 10% of our respective organizations was challenging, very challenging. Some firms wanted to provide it, some did not. We ended up getting a scorecard, but of I think it was 11 firms, which was helpful. But trying to update that scorecard in the future was almost impossible. And with this work, as you know, it's hard to take actions when you don't know the problem you're trying to solve. So where you have to look at the data to see where the problems are, and leverage that to get momentum to take action as an industry. So I think there was, when we lost the momentum around getting the data, I think we lost momentum as a CEO roundtable. I also think that we and I probably needed to shift strategy a little bit sooner to engage the top or the head DI people and the head HR people at these respective firms, because the CEOs only have so much time. So I think going forward, that's really a key element of this, is to make sure, in addition to the CEO, we have their chief diversity officer, we have their HR leader at the table, and they're ready to take these actions up, including deal with the tough issue of, folks, we need to look at the data, we can aggregate it, we can anonymize it, but if we're not looking at the data, sort of what are we doing?
Right. No, that was very powerful, that dashboard, and I don't think it had ever happened before. So it really was a seminal moment in, senior management coming together and sharing information. Let's talk a bit about hiring from the outside. And so one of my favorite Boston Fed stories was the town hall meeting where 100% of the people showed up. And the reason 100% of the people showed up is a conversation that was a difficult one took place, which was the Fed acknowledging that a place that was focused on really work-life balance and almost lifetime employment in many ways. I mean, not to say they're exemplary, fantastic people, have been there a very long time, but we had to come to the conclusion that we were not going to be able to change the senior management of the bank if we didn't bring in people from the outside. And normally companies have a progression where you do well, you move up, you get promoted, and you keep going up the food chain. But if we want to introduce people that don't exist in an organization to start with, don't we have to take a tough decision to bring people in from the outside and have that conversation on why that value is important to our company?
So absolutely. Again, here's where the EDAC was invaluable, because those workforce policies, one of which was hiring externally and internally, right? Or, making sure that we posted our positions internally and externally for officer, manager, and director level positions, came through the support of, at first, running it by the EDAC, then going to the executive committee. So that was critical. And in fact, it has helped us to obtain diverse talent. So, I think, yes, it's important to promote from within, and certainly to the extent that you have diversity within your pipeline, you certainly want to make sure that they're getting a fair shot and competing and have a chance to win opportunities. But the reality of it is, and this, there are gaps, if you will, or areas of weakness with the pipeline for most firms. And so you may not have the diverse VPs that you need to promote to the next level, or you may not have a certain level that you have to start in opening up your hiring practices to bring that talent in so they can be developed and move up the chain. And we've benefited from that. We've also benefited most recently, as you know, from hiring at that senior VP level directly from the outside. So I think it's a strategy that you have to embrace. It's a little uncomfortable because it rocks the boat a little bit, because you have people inside who think they're the incumbents, if you will. But no one's saying you can't, you're not able to compete if you're an inside person. It's just saying that you may have a little more competition.
Right. So now, since we started rocking the boat, let's rock it a little more. This idea of compensation being tied to diversity and inclusion outcomes. This is a hard one. Most people definitely at the top of the house get paid for getting a financial outcome. And we made a decision that it was important to tie performance in transforming an organization at the same level that it mattered in terms of transforming the financial success of the bank. So Talk to us about how that came to be, and also how do we think it'll play out? Because that's a newer strategy, isn't it?
It is one of the newer strategies that we've employed maybe two or so years ago. We started out by rolling it out with our executive committee first, and then we rolled it out to all the officers. And there's still some work to do on that front, but we have seen progress in diversity in the promotion level for people of color. We've seen progress in a number of other areas. So we know that this is an important strategy that takes time to integrate into your culture, but just because it's challenging, you can't back away from the challenging stuff. If you do, you just won't make progress.
Right. And we struggled a little bit with how far to push that down into the organization, didn't we? I mean, it's one thing to tell the CEO that 20% of his comp is based on how the organization looks. He's got to go round up 20 more people in different verticals around the company to say, now you guys make this happen. So how far do you push it down into the organization that comp is tied to performance, but also to transformation and inclusion?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we look at things like inclusion as a leadership competency. So if you're leading people, it's something that you should be evaluated against and measured, and it's something that is a part of what you bring to the table to the organization. So I think in the reasonably near future, we will be pushing this down to all people leaders. There shouldn't be any different expectations from the president all the way down to a supervisor or manager, because we're responsible for the organization, if you will, developing people, making sure that there's fairness and equity. And so anybody that leads people should have some kind of an incentive, and maybe it's not financial, it could be another incentive that is tied to DI objectives, so that they're being measured and assessed and held accountable for making progress.
Right. So let's talk about buying yourself a little time as you implement this. And that's where I think affinity groups may start to come in, because while I don't think we all believe that an organization will transform, or maybe you do, but I'm not sure we can transform an organization with an affinity group. I do think they play an important role. And it's also a way to start showing your commitment up and down the whole food chain of your organization, so
Sure.
that the lowest level to the top is addressed. Can you talk a bit about how that works in the bank?
Sure. So we stood up, now there's 9 affinity groups, and they're all sort of organically led. So for example, there's an African-American affinity group called Nexus. And that came from a group of African-American employees who decided they wanted to come together and support each other and try to figure out how to help each other navigate the organization. They wanted to help the organization attract and retain talent. And so we have there's a charter, there's a mission, they have guidelines, and they have a governance structure where there's somebody that's a leader of the ERG, and they also get an executive sponsor, somebody at the vice president level, to support their objectives of trying to increase inclusion at the bank. So that's happening across 9 different sort of organizations, if you will. Again, mostly protected classes, and it represents about 40% of our company. And the other key thing about that is that this is, again, grassroots, employee-led. Staff certainly want to hear about diversity and inclusion and understand it, and hear from folks like me and you and the head of HR. But it's a whole different story when somebody that is sitting across the cube for them is telling them why diversity and inclusion is important, and helping people to stand in their shoes. And so it is a huge part of changing the culture of our workplace at the bank. And we couldn't be more excited about how much traction those groups have gotten, and how much they've helped us along a number of fronts related to inclusion.
That's great. So the big 5, you got it there. I think there's a lot to implement. Let's talk a bit about whether the Boston Fed was a leader or a follower in the 12-bank system of implementing diversity and inclusion strategies. And either way, what was different about our bank in terms of leadership, commitment, or other things that set us apart?
Yes. So I would say our External Diversity Advisory Council sets us apart. We're willing to sort of open the kimono up and share kind of our strategies and approaches and take the criticism and be willing to get pushed to do more. It's been incredible. A CEO roundtable, these things aren't easy to do, if you will, right? To bring CEOs together and try to push an industry forward. So I think we're unique on those two fronts. I think we're unique in just what you talked about earlier. We're the first reserve bank to take inclusion to the conference of chairs in front of the, Chair Yellen, Chair Bernanke and Vice Chair Yellen at the time to help move the needle on this work. And we are one of the first reserve banks to connect DI objectives to incentives, which is a tough slog, not easy to do and really important. Now, I will say that a number of reserve banks have done some similar kinds of initiatives and efforts. Most of the reserve banks are doing, I think, really, really good work in the D&I space. Some may be leading more on things like supplier diversity than we are, although we're probably one of the leaders there too. But certainly we've taken it seriously, and I would say the leadership engagement, obviously starting with kind of you, Kirk, as chair of our board at the time, but also as you innovated. Eric and Ken are at the table. They're at the table. They're driving this. This is the only way I think I could do the work, or my team could do the work that we do, is the support that we have from them. So
great. No, that's fantastic. You might want to lean a little closer just with your mic because you're warbling a little bit.
Sure.
No problem. So, what do you think, and we've covered a bunch of these, what do you think your greatest successes or failures of the last decade of implementing D&I strategy have been?
Yeah, so I think we've centralized, we've decentralized diversity and inclusion at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So I think every business leader, every department are now stakeholders in trying to advance D&I. That was not easy to do. It took a while, but it's huge. Things like, receiving the human resources, it's the Corporate Equality Index, LGBTQ, best places to work for LGBTQ for the last 6 years in a row is something that we're quite proud of. Our board diversity, our board director level diversity is, 2/3 of our board directors are diverse by ethnicity or gender. Significant, significant improvement in our diversity at our OSHA level for people of color. And our hiring for both women and people of color over the last several years have been very strong. We need to continue it, but those are measurable, metrics, if you will, that show us that we're going in the right direction. We need to keep working, but it's encouraging to see that kind of progress.
No, that's amazing. I mean, 2/3 of your board diverse by gender or ethnicity. I would put that up against any Fortune 500 company in the country, and so proud to have been part of making that happen. But and there were hard choices along the way, but that wouldn't have happened except for leadership at the top. So let's talk a bit about why might the Boston Fed be more successful than some of the regulated institutions that it's responsible for. I mean, you've just described it. We can't find a board of 2/3 diversity, I don't think, in a Boston or a footprint of the Boston Fed. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, again, it is that senior level leadership is critical. If they're not bought in, if they're not dropping their shoulders and trying to help make this work go forward, it's not going to go forward. So I think that's just right out of the gate. You have to have that. And then I'd say that it's become part of who we are, right? It's become part of something that we're proud of as an organization. It's become part of our culture. And that isn't easy to do. I don't have any sort of, formula for that, but that's happened. And when that happens, great things can happen, going forward. And I think those are really two key things. That it has been D&I, and particularly the I, has been ingrained in our culture. Now it's an expectation of everybody in the organization. And we're all trying to push forward to make it happen. And that's nothing that the ODI, my office, could do or HR could do alone. You've got to have that sort of collective engagement and momentum, and we're happy that we do.
Yeah. So I've got two more questions, and then we're going to open it up, and you all can volunteer your questions through the chat, and Michelle will read them. these are higher level questions that are really celebrating the Fed's leadership, but also identifying the real challenges as a result of that leadership. So
Kirk,
let's
could
start.
I go back? Could I go back for 1 second?
Sure.
I apologize. I need to add one other comment regarding your question, which is around data. So we had agreed to look at our data in a very serious and granular way prior to Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act, but certainly that section of the act motivated us to do even more. We publish our data annually on our workforce, our hierarchy, if you will, and our procurement spend every year. Okay, so it's pretty transparent how we're doing. We get, different organizations and advocacy groups pushing on us to do more, encouraging us when we're doing well. There's something about that level of transparency and that seriousness of looking at your data and taking actions to make progress that's really critical too. And I encourage this industry to think about that and take that up.
No, absolutely. Thank you for highlighting that. So the Boston Fed several years ago did a report that's been widely referenced these days called the Color of Money Report, which talked about, for those of you who don't recall, the net worth of a non-diverse family in Boston being as low as $8 versus the net worth of a diverse family in Boston being as low as $8, and the net worth of a non-diverse family being $247,000. $8 for diverse, $247 for non-diverse. That highlighted the wealth gap that we have in our city and the state. But what are the steps that the Fed is considering to help close that gap? What's the follow-up to the Color of Money report? And what is the role of the Fed in closing that gap, in your opinion?
Sure. So I will say that that report was developed by our office, our regional community outreach group. They do amazing work on these fronts. They are currently standing up research on the impacts of COVID, the disparate impacts of COVID on healthcare, employment, childcare, et cetera, for low and moderate income community, which is many are Black and brown. So that I think is one of the sort of after effects of the Color of Wealth report. There is, as you're aware, Kirk, the Working Cities Challenge. We are going into different cities that are, have some challenges around economic development. They could be considered formerly gateway cities, and trying to ensure that the leadership in those cities are working collaboratively on these issues of housing, on economic development, on employment, et cetera, to make progress. But I also think there's an influence piece to this. So as you're aware, the Chamber of Commerce has stood up an initiative called the Pay Centers, which is focused on providing dollars and resources to minority and women-owned businesses to support building wealth in these communities. So I see on a number of fronts, we are either doing work, specifically doing research, and or influencing work that's taking place externally that is addressing these issues.
Yeah, and I'm glad you highlighted Eric's commitment, because I can't have ever been more proud than to discover that one of his seminal moments as a president of the Fed was his involvement in the Working Cities Initiative. I know that's near and dear to his heart, and it's very important that gets daylight in Washington for those communities of color and of low and moderate means as well, with his voice, because it's so well
it's actually a model. It's actually a model that other reserve banks are looking at replicating. So, it may have impact in other parts of the country, which we are quite proud of.
Okay. So the last question, and then we'll just summarize and then we'll move to Q&A, is about the moment we're in right now. The fact that the generational wealth gap that we just described is at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement and the health gaps that we've seen laid bare and evident by COVID-19. What do you think the role of the Fed and its solving for its dual mandate is in helping to resolve this moment we're in now? It's a big question.
It is a big question. I mean, I think it's continued leadership, particularly around things like the research for things like the Color of Wealth, right? Because that has so much impact and influence. the research around the disparate impacts of COVID on communities of color. I believe that the Regional Community Outreach Department has produced 3 white papers on these topics that are informing, educating, and motivating a number of internal and external stakeholders to take these issues seriously. And I think at some point we will move to looking at policies around economic development, healthcare, with kind of an equity lens. How are these policies either inadvertently or overtly disparaging or having negative impacts on these different groups, these different LMI groups in diverse communities? And we want to shed light on that to engage and encourage leaders to take action and address those issues. So there's some things that we can do directly, but there is a lot that we can do by leveraging research, like you've referred to earlier, that motivates external actors, public and private partners, to take up these efforts and push these issues forward. So
I have top five takeaways, and perhaps you've got 5 or 2 or 3. Here's what I'd share from what I gleaned from our conversation today. Don't start a conversation in your organization if you don't plan to take action. Having a town hall and hashing it out and kumbaya and hugging it out will not change.
Right.
And the last 10 years at the Fed have been very much about taking action, as you heard Marques outlay it. Urgency and context is the difference between people who are passionate about the Black Lives Matter movement and perhaps those who are not. You know, as we started at the top of the hour, my 400 years is not your 4 months of being woke. So you got to remember, your people you're talking to have been living this for a very long time. Their parents lived it before them and their grandparents. And so, you know, the well-intentioned is good, but you got to put it into context. It's a harsh context. Inclusion has to be part of your corporate culture. I heard you say that a few times. I absolutely agree. And I have a partner in Dick Galvin. We have a company called Accordia. Accordia means to grant or give and empower people. I mean, we named our company about what we're about. So you can tell we believe in the culture. We're going to get tattoos next. Lastly, the External Diversity Advisory Council, reaching out to people who are in your network, who are diverse individuals who can help you get best practices, is the fastest way to ramp up to success in your own company. And I think you got to imagine that EDAC is a diversity and inclusion laboratory. That's how I see it. You try stuff, it doesn't work. You try something else, you test it out, you put it to work, and then you fix it, change it, or implement it. So those are my top 4. And the 5th one is anything that you gleaned from this conversation that you think might be useful. So Marques, how about you? What did you take away? Is there anything you want to kind of make sure people don't forget if they forget everything else?
Yeah, so I mean, you hit a lot of them, but I would go back to the data piece that, you know, it's tough to fix what you can't sort of identify as a core issue, right? And sometimes data is an important part of that. So don't be afraid of that. I think, to your point, Kirk, there's a need to be deliberate and intentional in this work. If you're not going to be deliberate, intentional, don't even bother. This is not easy slogging. This is hard work. You need to dedicate a resource to this. They need to drop their shoulders every day. And if they don't, you will not make progress. That's my view. I could be wrong about that. Leadership engagement is absolutely critical. And they need to be the most sort of engaged and committed. And there needs to be accountability. This kind of goes back to the data piece. Some of that will be qualitative, some of that will be quantitative, but you need to have accountability. And the incentives don't have to be financial. It could be other things, but people need to be held accountable, incentive to do the right things. And not even just do the right thing, but to make sure that their approach to hiring and promoting and developing is equitable, is fair, and it isn't biased by, you know, whether where they went to school or where they grew up. Those things are really, really important. And then the one thing that, again, is an area that I wish I did more and is really important is to be bold, right? this is a time to be bold in our efforts. This is a time, I think, for all the reasons you alluded to, Kirk, with this moment, to draw a line and to really stand up with efforts and initiatives that will move the dial. If we're not going to do it now, when are we going to do it? And so, in my view, that's what I would put forward.
Fantastic. So we're going to roll into a few minutes of Q&A. We managed to cover 10 years in 45 minutes. That was pretty good. Now we'll turn it over to Michelle, and she'll let us know what people have been listening in might want to know more about. Michelle?
Great, thanks. We have a lot of questions. I hope we can get to them. My name is Michelle Landers. I'm the Executive Director of ULI Boston, New England. I want to thank both Kirk and Marques and all of our partners for working on this webinar today. So let's get right to it. We had a question from both Kate Dilawari and Alan Razik about the External Advisory Council. Who are the members? What firms do they come from? What is your selection criteria for that group?
Marques?
Sure. So they are C-suite executives from different industries in the New England, in New England, essentially. And by C-suite, I mean, so these are people, at least on the executive committee, many are CEOs or second in charge or general counsel. They're leaders that have had real impact on the strategy and the policies of the firms that they work at. And have some level of passion for D&I. So I would say those are critical criteria. Did I miss anything, Kirk, that we should put on the table?
No, the only thing I'd say is that it has evolved over time. You know, when it started, I think I unfortunately shared that I sort of raided my network and grabbed all of my best friends that met that description. It's now evolved to be more women, which is great, more Latinx representation. So, you know, it's not static. I think you got to keep getting different voices to the table. Let's kick it back to you, Michelle, because we'll try to get as many as we can.
Sure. The next question comes from Daryl Settles. He wanted to circle back to the CEO roundtable. Regarding the strategy of focusing on women first and then people of color, do you think that was the right strategy? If you were to start the initiative today, would you use the same strategy?
Marques,
Sure. So, you know, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, I think when we looked at our data, because we had collected a dashboard of data, top representation of the top 10% of our firms, the metric that stood out, or the issue that stood out, was women in our firms were underrepresented. So that's where we started. We have integrated race into the discussion. And can we do more, and should we do more? Absolutely.
Yeah. And the one thing I would say is that as it was clear that Dodd-Frank wasn't going to have a supervision and regulatory mandate on this topic external to the bank, we had to encourage people to stay in the room and feel that they were constructively participating. So I think we started where we thought people had the most easily gained kind of points of success. And it was true. But we also were pretty clear to say, you got to reach further down to educate people of color about the opportunities in your industry. You can't just rely on hoping you get the top 6 people at Wharton. You know, everybody wants them, you know. So anyway, the group continues to evolve. Let's try another one.
There were a couple of questions about the incentives. What are some examples of the incentives and how did that work?
Sure. So here in Boston, we looked at the last 5 years of hires, promotions, and separations for each department. So first we look across the bank, then we look by department, and we tried to, again, compare it to external benchmarks to see where we were doing well and where we weren't. And then we focused our leaders by department on areas where they could make progress. And we tied directional incentives to making progress. So it wasn't that you have to go from 5% to 8% women. We just want to see positive directional progress where you have a gap with, let's say, women. So that was on the workforce front. And then we also asked them to look at their culture of inclusion. So we have climate survey questions and other kinds of poll surveys that we use to get a sense of the culture of inclusion by department. And we're encouraging our leaders to look at those issues, identify gaps and challenges, and there's a certain percentage of the incentive is tied to that as well. So we focus on both workforce and inclusion with the incentives. And again, we started at the executive committee so we could flush out the approach and model, and then rolled it all the way down to all the officers.
And then there's a follow-up. Are there specific examples of incentives, or I'm sorry, this is about initiatives. Can you provide specific examples of initiatives that worked and maybe some that did not, and what the lessons might be that you can apply?
Sure. So doubling down on our outreach to professional organizations for women and for Hispanic professionals worked. It was important. We knew we needed to do it, but then we also had to make sure that our hiring managers had the skills that they needed to be open-minded about who they're hiring, and to understand, again, their data, where they may have had some challenges. So that was something that worked. What didn't work for us, quite frankly, is we used executive search firms to hire talent, to go out to acquire diverse talent at more senior levels. And we found that that was not very successful. They were finding the same people that we were finding, and they weren't really bringing anybody of what we need, a caliber to the table, quite frankly. So we dialed back on using executive search firms.
And I'd like to highlight just once again your leadership and Eric's leadership in the board transformation. So when I joined the board in 2008, there was one person of color, me, and one woman at the time. And to go from 2 to 2/3 of a board is an important, notable transformation. So,
thanks, Kirk.
There are a couple of questions about partnerships with external community organizations. What has your outreach been? Where have you formed some good working partnerships?
Sure. So there are a number of different groups that we've worked with externally. Boston Women in Finance. The Partnership is a group that we partner with. Conexión, which is focused in the Latino community, Latino professionals. And I could actually go on and on. There's Women in Technology, there's Twigo. So we try to identify partners, professional organizations that can assist us when we have representation gaps in our workforce. So that's been the sort of the connection, if you will. And we've actually seen some real progress by partnering with these groups, and by leveraging them to help get the word out about our focus on D&I and what we bring to the table as an organization, where we may not pay as much as Wall Street, but our benefits are really quite good. And the work that you do here includes things like FedNow, where we're standing up an entirely new payment system for the country. So we leverage these partnerships to identify talent, but also to showcase the fact that we're a reasonably good organization on this front of D&I, and to help us tell our story.
and you know what, that reputation as the commitment of the bank to inclusion helps hire the higher level positions as well, because people are not, as we know, looking just to get a paycheck. They want an environment that they think they can thrive in. And then the last piece I'd say on this is that we recognize the role of education as well. So we didn't just reach up through search firms. We reached down through 4-Day Institute to recruit women of color and women and people of color. And then we have supported education programs around our financial literacy capabilities, but also to show how people could find their way into a reserve bank. And we can do that in lots of sectors, right?
So there was a question about the data you mentioned. What kind of data were you collecting? And then the flip side, I guess, would be, what are some of the qualitative metrics that the Fed is using in addition to those quantitative metrics?
Sure. So we have dashboards on, for example, the percentage of minority and women at the staff level, at the professional level, at the management level, at the mid-management level and senior management level. We look at that on an ongoing basis, monthly. And we collect data on our hiring by gender and ethnicity. We're collecting data on our separations, on who's leaving and why by gender and ethnicity. We could collect data along the lines of our generations, what's happening with folks who have been here for 2 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, et cetera. And so we try to leverage that information to inform our leaders, our department vice presidents and officers around where there's opportunities and challenges. Qualitatively, we do climate surveys on a probably every other year basis. Tim, we have several questions in there around inclusion to get a sense of, are we making progress on the bank's culture of inclusion? We also follow up with different kinds of pulse surveys by department, if you will, or to get a sense within that department, do they have challenges or are they making more or less progress than they need to? So I would say, quantitatively, it's looking at a lot of people metrics data, workforce data, as on the quantitative side, and qualitatively, it's more climate survey related kinds of data.
Great. So we had a couple of questions about inclusion. Willie Flynn wrote, it is one thing to invite people to the table, which is to be applauded. My question is, what do you feel are the keys to creating a sense of belonging and inclusion in the organization?
Sure. So one of the keys we believe is, leaders, the role that they play in what they say, how they behave, and how they operate. So there needs to be alignment along those lines. Because if there's not, for example, they might say the right things, they might actually act the right way, but then when it comes to either the hiring or promoting or how they operate or who they give the key assignments to, if you don't have inclusion there, then you don't have inclusion. Right? So it's really, what are leaders saying, behaving, and operating? How do we give them tools to make sure that there's alignment along those fronts? So that's really critical. And then there's a lot of work that we do around allyship, and there's a lot of work we do around creating a speak-up culture. That is really, really important. And then there's a lot of work we do around feedback, making sure people get feedback and making sure that you're able to, let's say I'm a non-diverse manager, I'm able to give feedback, constructive and positive, to a diverse individual, right? That if you don't do these kinds of things, you actually don't get the inclusion that you're looking for.
So, and the other thing I'd like to say is there's something about supporting your leaders and knowing that you're committed to them. And so I'm a board member at Real Estate Executive Council. Tammy Jones is the chairwoman. The idea of taking your executives and putting them in an environment where they will feel supported, where they can gain knowledge and bring it back to their organization, is what major companies should be doing. And whether it's real estate and having them join RECs or sponsoring RECs or REEC, I'm sorry, or financial services and doing it through NASP. I mean, that's an important network that shows your conviction and commitment to a heavy role for those people in your organization.
So I have to build on that for just 1 second, Kirk. We have a conference of first vice presidents. So these are the people that are second in charge, chief operating officers across the reserve banks. They come together and they focus on different issues, one of which includes diversity and inclusion. One of the key motivators for them to stand up a 3-phased D&I strategy with work streams and engaging folks like myself across the reserve banks and across the Federal Reserve System was having a conversation with two leaders from the outside. One was the former chief diversity officer for Coca-Cola, and the other was the former chief diversity officer for Georgia Power. So they had a no holds barred, candid conversation with these individuals, and that was a huge catalyst to a lot of D&I work that was being driven by the number 2 people across the Federal Reserve System. So to your point, Kirk, that is important. Yeah,
I think, Michelle, we're just about out of time, it looks like. I really want to thank Marques first and foremost. One, for taking a job that didn't exist before and then turning it into an amazing platform to change the Federal Reserve Bank system in America. So you deserve a huge vote of confidence, and it's been my pleasure and sort of honor to support you. The other thing I want to say is that, as I told Chairman Bernanke and Vice Chairman Yellen, as well as my fellow Reserve Bank chairs, if you plan to only have this conversation once, let's not do it. And, it was nice to get it on the agenda in Washington for the first time in 100 years. If that was the last time it happened, I'd rather have not had the conversation. So I'm so honored that we are continuing to have the conversation and evolving. I want to thank ULI, NAIOP, GREB, CREW, DCC, and REEC for their role in creating this forum. And I want to thank again, Marques, for everything you've done. Michelle, I'll hand it back to you to turn us out.
Thank you.
Kirk.
Thank you both very much, and thank you to our partners. This is one of a series of programs and initiatives that we've been working on for a number of years. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of the great questions, but maybe we can forward these to our panelists and just distribute some of the answers to the attendees. Thank you everyone for attending. Keep your eyes open for more programming like this through ULI and through our other regional partners. Appreciate your time today and have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.